The farmhand dropped his bucket when he saw the smoke. Black and thick, it rose from the turf house across the frozen field. By the time he reached the door, the heat had already warped the timber frame. Inside, beneath a collapsed beam, lay two figures. But the flames had not killed them. The marks on their bodies told a different story. What had happened in that isolated farmstead on the 14th of March, 1828? Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you are from and what time you are watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let us begin. It was Thursday, the 14th of March, 1828, in the northern reaches of Iceland. Winter had not yet released its grip upon the land. Snow lay thick across the volcanic soil of Vatnsdalur Valley, and the wind carried the salt smell of the northern sea. The sun, when it appeared at all, cast pale light across the scattered farmsteads that dotted the isolated landscape. At Illugastaðir, a remote property some miles from the nearest settlement, smoke rose from the turf house where Natan Ketilsson lived and worked his land. He was a man of 40 years, unmarried, a farmer of some prosperity by local measure. He kept servants in his household. Among them was a woman named Agnes Magnusdottir, 33 years of age, who had served in his employ for some months past. She had been born to unmarried tenant farmers in 1795, abandoned by her father before she could walk, and raised in foster care from the age of 6. She knew poverty. She knew hardship. She knew the particular cruelty reserved for those born outside the bonds of marriage in a harsh and isolated land. What the rescuers found in that burning house would lead to a trial that would echo across 2 centuries, and to a death that would mark Iceland's history forever. The months preceding the 14th of March had passed without particular incident, or so it seemed to those who dwelt in the scattered farms of the valley. Natan Ketilsson maintained his household in the manner of a man accustomed to authority. He rose before dawn. He tended to his livestock. He saw to the management of his property, which included several tenant farmers who worked portions of his land in exchange for shelter and a share of what little the frozen earth would yield. Agnes had arrived at Illugastaðir in the autumn of the previous year. She performed the duties expected of a domestic servant. She prepared meals over the peat fire. She mended clothing. She washed linen in water drawn from the well and heated in iron pots. The work was ceaseless, the conditions severe. The turf house provided shelter from the wind, but dampness seeped through the walls, and in winter the cold was profound. There were others in the household. A young woman named Sigríður Guðmundsdóttir, 17 years of age, also worked as a maid. A man named Friðrik Sigurðsson, in his early 20s, laboured as a farmhand. The 3 servants shared the cramped quarters designated for those of their station, while Natan occupied the better rooms reserved for the master of the house. It was said, though never spoken openly, that Natan conducted relations with both women in his employ. It was said that he had fathered children with a married woman in the district, a poet of some local renown named Rosa. It was said that he possessed knowledge of herbs and medicines, that he called himself a doctor, though he had received no formal training. It was said he was a man of learning, of charm, of certain prospects. It was also said he was cruel. Agnes performed her duties without complaint. She woke before the household stirred. She banked the fire at night after the others had retired. She spoke little. Neighbours who encountered her at market or along the frozen paths remarked upon her quietness, her composed manner, the way she kept her eyes lowered when addressed. Nothing in her bearing suggested what was to come. By early March, the winter stores were depleting. The household existed in that particular state of waiting common to such isolated places, where spring represented not renewal, but merely survival. On the 13th of March, a visitor arrived at Illugastaðir. His name was Pétur Jónsson, a travelling worker seeking shelter for the night. Natan, in keeping with the customs of hospitality that governed even the poorest households, granted him accommodation. The man was given food, a place near the fire, permission to rest his journey-weary body beneath the turf roof. That evening passed as evenings passed. The household gathered for the evening meal. Peat burned in the hearth. Outside, darkness fell early, as it did in that northern latitude. The wind rose. Inside the thick walls, the small company ate in relative warmth. Conversation, if there was any, was not recorded. By the account given later, Agnes and Sigríður retired to their quarters. Friðrik remained longer, attending to tasks about the farmstead before seeking his own rest. Natan and his guest Pétur settled near the fire. The house fell quiet. Snow began to fall again, as it had fallen intermittently for weeks, covering the landscape in renewed silence. What occurred in the hours that followed would be pieced together only through fragments, through testimony given under examination, through the evidence discovered in the ashes. It was established that, at some point during the night, violence erupted within those turf walls. It was established that Natan Ketilsson suffered blows to the head, delivered with force sufficient to fracture bone. It was established that Pétur Jónsson sustained similar injuries. It was established that both men were stabbed repeatedly, the blade entering flesh multiple times with deliberate intent. The weapon used was later identified as a knife kept in the household for ordinary purposes: the cutting of meat, the preparation of meals, the mending of leather. It had been taken from its customary place. It had been employed for a purpose far removed from its intended use. After the deaths, after the blood had soaked into the earthen floor, after the bodies had ceased their movements, fire was set. Shark oil, stored for use in lamps, was poured liberally throughout the interior. Flames took hold quickly in the dry peat and timber. Smoke rose thick and black into the frozen morning air. By the time neighbours arrived, summoned by Agnes herself, who had run to the nearest farm with news of the blaze, the interior was consumed. The roof had partially collapsed. The heat was still intense. The men who arrived to extinguish the fire worked quickly despite the cold. They drew water from the well. They formed a line, passing buckets hand to hand. The flames resisted their efforts, fed by the oil that had been so deliberately distributed. When at last the blaze was controlled, when smoke, rather than flame, dominated the ruins, they entered. The bodies were discovered in the main room, collapsed near where the hearth had stood. Both were severely burned, the flesh blackened and split by heat. But beneath the damage wrought by fire, other injuries were visible. The skull of the first man showed clear signs of blunt trauma. Deep wounds marked the torso of both victims, gaping and unmistakable even through the char. A constable was summoned from the district seat. He arrived by mid-afternoon, riding through snow that had begun to fall more heavily. His name was recorded in the subsequent reports. He examined the scene with the methodical attention required by his office. He noted the position of the bodies. He noted the distribution of oil residue. He noted the knife, partially melted by heat, found near one of the deceased. Items were collected and set aside for examination. Fragments of clothing, tools from the household, the oil container, nearly empty. Each piece was wrapped and labelled according to procedure. Witnesses were questioned separately. The neighbours who had responded to the alarm gave their statements. The surviving members of the household, Agnes, Sigríður, and Friðrik, were taken into custody. By evening, the house stood empty, save for the bodies awaiting removal. A guard was posted. The snow continued its quiet accumulation, covering the scorched earth around the ruined structure, softening the harsh evidence of violence with its white indifference. The following morning, the bodies were transported to a location where a more thorough examination could be conducted. A local official with some medical knowledge was assigned the task. His report, completed over 2 days, detailed the nature and extent of the injuries. The conclusion was unambiguous. Both men had been murdered, struck from behind while they slept or sat unaware. The fire had been set afterward, a transparent attempt to conceal the crime beneath ashes and ruin. Within a week, formal charges were laid against all 3 servants. The murder of Natan Ketilsson and Pétur Jónsson would proceed to trial. The entire district spoke of nothing else. The examination of the deceased was conducted with the limited resources available in that remote district. The official charged with the task noted multiple wounds to the head and torso of both victims. In his written report, submitted to the Superior Court, he stated that Natan Ketilsson had sustained at least 3 distinct blows to the skull, any one of which might have proved fatal. The weapon appeared to have been a blunt implement, possibly a hammer kept for household repairs. In addition to the blunt trauma, both bodies exhibited stab wounds. These were counted and measured. Natan bore 5 such injuries, penetrating the chest and abdomen. Pétur Jónsson showed similar wounds, 4 in number, delivered with what the examiner described as considerable force. The depth and angle of the wounds suggested they had been inflicted while the victims lay prone or seated, unable to defend themselves effectively. Samples of the oil used to accelerate the fire were preserved in sealed containers. The substance was identified as shark liver oil, commonly used throughout Iceland for lighting purposes. Its presence in such quantity, distributed deliberately rather than spilled by accident, indicated clear intent to destroy evidence through incineration. The knife recovered from the scene was examined. Blood residue remained visible despite the heat damage. The blade matched the dimensions of the wounds observed on both bodies. It was a common kitchen implement, unremarkable save for its employment in the commission of murder. Testimony was gathered from neighbours regarding the character and circumstances of those involved. Several witnesses reported that Agnes had seemed distressed in the weeks prior to the murders. Others stated they had observed arguments between Natan and his servants, though the substance of these disputes was not clear. One neighbour recalled seeing Friðrik in possession of a hammer some days before the incident, though he could not say with certainty it was the same implement later suspected in the crime. The findings were compiled, sealed, and forwarded to the authorities responsible for prosecution. The evidence pointed unmistakably toward the 3 servants. The question was not whether they had committed the acts, but what had driven them to such violence. If you are finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let us continue. Within days of the examination's completion, formal arrest warrants were issued. Agnes Magnúsdóttir, Sigríður Guðmundsdóttir, and Friðrik Sigurðsson were taken into custody and held separately to await trial. Each was questioned at length. Their statements, recorded in the careful hand of the magistrate's clerk, revealed contradictions and shifting accounts. Agnes maintained her innocence. Friðrik claimed he had acted under compulsion. Sigríður wept and said little of substance. The evidence was transported under guard to Reykjavík, where the trial would be conducted before the territorial court. The trial commenced on the 14th of March, 1830, precisely 2 years after the murders at Illugastaðir. The proceedings were held in Reykjavík before a panel of judges appointed under Danish colonial authority. Iceland remained a territory of the Danish crown, and all legal matters of serious nature were adjudicated according to Danish law and procedure. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity. The case had attracted attention throughout the territory. The notion that two women and a young man, all of servant status, had conspired to murder their master and his guest struck at the foundations of social order. Every farm owner in the district had been ordered to send a representative to observe the proceedings, that they might carry the lesson back to their own households. The prosecution presented its evidence methodically. The medical examiner testified to the nature of the wounds. The constable described the scene as he had found it. Witnesses recounted their observations of discord within the household. The knife, the hammer, the oil container, all were displayed before the judges. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Agnes was questioned at length. She admitted to being present in the house. She admitted to knowledge of Natan's death, but she denied wielding the weapons herself. She claimed Friðrik had struck the blows, that she had been powerless to prevent it, that fear had kept her silent. Her testimony was calm, her voice steady, her manner composed. The judges noted this in their remarks. They found her demeanour suspicious, her protestations unconvincing. Friðrik, when called, contradicted portions of Agnes's account. He stated that the plan had originated with her, that she had promised him money and favour if he would assist in the murders. He admitted to striking Natan, but claimed Agnes had stabbed both victims. His testimony shifted under questioning. The judges grew visibly impatient with his inconsistencies. Sigríður wept throughout her examination. She claimed ignorance of any plot, insisting she had slept through the violence and awakened only when the fire had already been set. The judges were inclined to believe her youth and tears, though they noted she had failed to raise an alarm or flee the house. After 3 days of testimony, the judges retired to deliberate. They returned within the hour. All 3 defendants were found guilty of willful murder. The sentence was death by beheading. The verdict was read aloud. Agnes remained motionless as the words were pronounced. The sentence was appealed to the Supreme Court in Copenhagen, as was required for all capital cases originating in the territories. Months passed while the appeal was considered. During this time, the 3 condemned prisoners were held in custody, separated from one another, allowed minimal contact with the outside world. Agnes was permitted to write letters. Several of these survived, preserved in the court archives. In them, she maintained her innocence. She wrote of her childhood, of the poverty that had shaped her life, of the limited choices available to a woman of her station. The letters were eloquent, suggesting an education unusual for one of her circumstances. In the summer of 1831, word arrived from Copenhagen. The Supreme Court had reviewed the case and upheld the convictions. However, Sigríður's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, to be served in Denmark. She was 17 years old. The court found her youth and limited involvement sufficient grounds for mercy. She was transported from Iceland in chains and was never seen again in her homeland. Records indicate she died in a Danish prison some years later, the exact date unrecorded. For Agnes and Friðrik, no such mercy was extended. The executions were scheduled for January of 1832. A special axe was imported from Denmark for the purpose, as Iceland possessed no such implement. The expense was considerable. The cost was duly recorded in the administrative ledgers of the colonial government. On the appointed day, all landowners in the northern districts were required to send a male representative to witness the executions. The site chosen was near the scene of the crime, that the lesson might be most vividly impressed upon those who observed. A platform was constructed. The crowd that gathered numbered in the hundreds, drawn by curiosity and by official compulsion. Friðrik was led to the block first. The axe fell cleanly. His head was severed from his body with a single stroke. Agnes was brought forward immediately after. She walked without assistance. She knelt without hesitation. The executioner was Natan's own brother, a fact noted by all present. The blade descended. Death was instantaneous. By order of the court, both heads were mounted on pikes along the roadside, that they might serve as warning to others who might contemplate violence against their betters. Within a day, both heads had vanished. Despite investigation, they were never recovered. It was whispered that a local woman, moved by pity or disgust, had stolen them under cover of darkness and buried them in unconsecrated ground. Agnes Magnusdottir holds the distinction of being the last woman executed in Iceland. Her story, buried for a century in court records and fading memory, has been revived in recent decades through books and dramatizations. In 2017, a symbolic retrial was conducted using contemporary legal standards. The verdict reached was a prison sentence of 14 years. Whether this constitutes justice or merely revision is a question each must answer for themselves. The farm at Illugastaðir stands empty now, reclaimed by wind and weather. The turf has returned to earth. Only stone foundations mark where the house once stood. In winter, when snow falls thick across the valley, the landscape appears unchanged from that distant March morning. Behind the silence, the wind carries nothing but cold air and the faint memory of smoke.